Hello and welcome to episode number 13 of Performing Labor. My name is Rob Simonds, and I am your host. This podcast features interviews with accomplished performing musicians who are doing interesting and creative work from within performing arts institutions and outside of them. We'll unpack their training, their practice, and their careers, how they got started, how they stay sharp, and their ambitions for the future. And it's my hope that these interviews will provide value no matter where you are on your musical journey. If you're an aspiring musician, a working musician, or if you're a music lover and just curious to learn more. This was a really inspiring conversation to have. My guest this week, Quinton Morris, he's one of the bright lights in this business. And going into this, I knew the challenge of the interview would simply be knowing where to cap it, knowing where to finish it. There's just too much to get to in one sitting. So I'm choosing to think of this specific interview as a part one. Rather than an incomplete picture, we'll circle back to a part two sooner than later. Quinton is a Seattle-based violinist, professor, educator, founder, filmmaker, radio host, and entrepreneur. And I chose not to qualify that last category as an arts entrepreneur, or social entrepreneur, or education entrepreneur, all of which, of course, he is, but rather it's a more all-encompassing ethos that informs the others. At least as it was related in the book, Ahead of the Curve. The Harvard Business School defines entrepreneurship as, quote, the relentless pursuit of opportunity beyond the constraints of the resources currently controlled, close quote. Through that lens, I think Quinton's pursuits embody entrepreneurship in a way that classical music's trendy embrace of it doesn't. We seem to confuse self-promotion or repackaging old ideas as new ones as entrepreneurship. Maybe what I'm saying is we confuse marketing with entrepreneurship. Undoubtedly, it's a part, but it's not the whole. And nothing better typifies Quinton's strategic, long-range vision in pursuit of opportunity and impact more than Key to Change, a nonprofit education organization that he founded specifically to serve the population of his native South King County, which, despite its proximity to Seattle, is still separate in important ways. It's separate in many of the same ways that it was when he was growing up there. And in addressing that lack of access, Quinton is not just seeing beyond the constraints of current resources just for himself. He's looking to unlock the opportunity for every kid who grows up in that county. As I reflected on our conversation, something that stuck out to me is the radical responsiveness of Key to Change. I don't want to give away too much about our conversation, but Quinton describes the pandemic's effect on the students' relationship with the organization in a very surprising and very affirming way. He's building connections on many levels, between teachers and students, peer-to-peer, between artists and scientists from outside Washington State to South King County. He talks about meeting the students where they are. And in doing so, he's helping them make the connection of learning an instrument and making music now to the rest of their lives. Quinton, when he was a kid himself, made the connection that being good at an instrument often correlates with good academic achievement, and that can unlock some economic doors to further success. But he's also seen the connection of music to the wider world, not something hermetic and self-referential. The Yale Law School professor, Amy Chua, who has written some really important works on democracy, but is probably best known for her book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. She exposed to a wider audience the discipline, and perhaps the horrors, of becoming good at these instruments. Perhaps Professor Chua is an extreme case, but anyone who has done well at these pursuits can recognize what she wrote as familiar. Chua writes that she fetishized difficulty, and that she chose the violin for her second daughter as a symbol. Quote, it symbolized excellence, refinement, and depth, respect for hierarchy, standards, and expertise. I deeply admire Professor Chua as an academic and writer. I don't think for a second that she's feigning or fabricating her feelings about her love of this music. She writes quite persuasively about it. However, this kind of training, albeit in lower doses, is pervasive in classical music. And for those who end up pursuing it as a career, it is perhaps essential to a degree. But a lot of it is more performative than formative. It pervades the classical music ecosystem, it's alienating, and its outcomes aren't good. It's the opposite of meeting people where they are. What happens when the fetish for difficulty for its own sake wears off? Particularly when the music is untethered from the cultural consensus it enjoyed in earlier generations. Well, we get people who are worried about who claps when. We get what Alex Ross wrote about more than 15 years ago in The New Yorker. Quote, "For at least a century, the music has been captive to a cult of mediocre elitism that tries to manufacture self-esteem by clutching at empty formulas of intellectual superiority." Rather than a superior or inferior, Quinton sees the music as a co-equal to the other liberal arts. He's integrating its study into a pragmatic and thorough education, linking the investment of time on the violin or viola now to better outcomes later. He's connecting the institution to a defined place. And most important of all, I think, the institution serves the kids and their education first. It's weighted towards their present and their future, more than it is about any symbolic artifacts of the past. Danielle Allen, professor of government and ethics at Harvard, and like Amy Chua, writes brilliantly about democracy. In her, what I would call essential book, Our Declaration, which I'll link to, she contrasts a time earlier in her career when she taught some of the nation's highest achieving undergrads by day at the University of Chicago. And in the very same room at night, she taught, quote, adult students who were without jobs or working two jobs or stuck in dead-end part-time jobs. In the way that canonic works can be worshipped to the point of inaccessibility, Professor Allen continues that these adult students thought the Declaration of Independence was something that didn't belong to them. But in her telling, their intellectual metamorphosis through absorbing our founding political philosophy was the instructive one. She writes, "The purpose of democracy is to empower individual citizens and give them sufficient control over their own lives to protect themselves from domination. Political equality is not, however, merely freedom from domination. The best way to avoid being dominated is to help build the world in which one lives, to help, like an architect, determine its pattern and structure." Quinton is both the architect and general contractor of empowerment in his neighborhood. The barriers for too many kids in too much of America, both rural and urban, are simply too high. And Quinton is helping bypass those barriers, and he's doing it and making gains during a once-in-a-generation health crisis. Please enjoy this interview with Quinton Morris. Quinton Morris, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to do this. I'm really excited to get into all these elements of your career. But let's start with South King County, Washington. I want to hear about how that place has changed. I want to hear about how it perhaps hasn't changed. And I want to know why you're located there with your nonprofit, Key to Change.
So I'd like to preface this by saying that for your listeners, that South King County is an area in Seattle. It's south of Seattle that is made up of a bunch of different suburbs. It's heavily under-resourced, and it has been for a really long time. I'm from Renton, which is one of the small suburbs of Seattle. And I, growing up there, did not have access to a music teacher in that area. I actually used to have to go north of Seattle for violin lessons. My teacher at that time was Walter Schweed, who was the associate concertmaster of the Seattle Symphony. And he lived in Bothell, which is way, way north. And so I would have to take 3 buses to go and take lessons with him or to go to youth symphony rehearsal because there was literally nothing in my area. And that was in the early 90s. And sadly, here we are now in 2020 and not much has changed. And so I have gotten to a point in my career where I felt like I wanted to create some meaningful change for students in South King County, not only in Renton, but all surrounding suburbs in the South King County area who don't have access to private lessons, who do not have access to a high quality music instruction. And so that is essentially how Key to Change was born, or the inspiration behind it, rather.
When you think back to your own childhood then in Renton, what do you think that those sacrifices you made as a kid for high quality music education, as you put it, what impact did that have on you at that age?
Well, I didn't really know what was available to me, to be honest with you, especially in that area. The arts were not funded very
Hmm.
well. Um, there weren't concerts in our area. There weren't. Um, we just didn't have access to really anything. And so if there was anything that you wanted to do, you had to go to Seattle in order to do it.
Hmm.
Well, my mom was a single parent, and I have a brother who's 11 years younger than I am. So, when I was 17, my brother was 6. So it wasn't like we were really able to um, do a bunch of stuff in the area. We would have to go to Seattle, and we didn't really even know what was really possible. Like I said, my teacher played in the orchestra, but we weren't really given much opportunity to explore anything classical music related.
Hmm. Well, how did you find your way to classical music? Was it your mom that turned you on to the idea?
Well, it started out in school. I mean, it was a recreational thing.
Hmm.
All my friends played violin or played some sort of instrument. It was kind of the thing to do. It was a lot of fun. I just happened to love playing the violin. Also, I think there was a scholastic component to it as well. Most of the kids who played in orchestra also were in the more advanced courses, advanced classes. And so I knew early on, and my mom used to always tell me, if you play an instrument, then you can get a scholarship to college. And if you keep your grades up and you play violin, and that's going to be attractive to colleges. She was right. I mean, my mom did not go to college. She has a high school. At that time, she had a high school diploma. And but she was really in tune, and she didn't have all the answers, but she had some smart answers, and that was one of them. And so, I think just the encouragement from my mom, as well as just my peers at school. I knew that playing an instrument was the way to go. Additionally, I should say that, I did play, I was a part of the Seattle Youth Symphony Orchestra program, but that presented its own set of challenges in the sense that I was a scholarship student because, we were, my mom did not make a lot of money. And so any sort of activity that even happened through the Seattle Youth Symphony Orchestra during that time, I didn't really have access to outside of the orchestra because most of the kids who were in that program during that time came from wealth.
Hmm.
I did not. And so that was looking back on that experience was even tough then because I just wasn't really informed, which I think even just brings me back to my point about key to change, which is key to change is so important to the community because we let students see themselves within the organization. So everything from guest artists that we bring in to just the board of directors to our staff to even our students are all representative of the community. It's all people that they can actually relate to. Being a 16-year-old kid from, Renton High School, and playing in a youth symphony orchestra or even just taking private lessons, like I didn't have anyone that I could really relate to. There was no one who looks like me, and there wasn't really anyone who had the same type of experience that I had.
Hmm.
Kids from South King County weren't going to Seattle to play in youth symphony orchestra or even take lessons because they didn't know it was available. And if they did know it was available, it was too expensive or it was too far, or there were all these barriers and all these hurdles that one had to jump through that were just too exhausting for a family who had limited resources. In my case, I worked a part-time job to pay for lessons, to pay for youth symphony or whatever activities I had to do. And the friends that I had who were also in school with me, my high school buddies, they also had parents who their moms were single parents as well. And so we all kind of encouraged each other, and really motivated each other to seek out things that were better for ourselves, because we knew what we had in the community was not enough for us.
It's funny you say that about your mom and drawing that connection to scholarships. My mother was a public school teacher, and I think she was very sensitive to the rising prices of colleges because she was sending her own students off. And it was imparted to me at a young age that scholarships would come if I would play the violin at a reasonable enough level. I don't think the intention was that I would go on and try and make a career out of this. Is that something you impart to your kids now, your students, that you kind of bundled that all together? So you said there's like an academic component, that these things are kind of complements to each other. Is that something you stress for your own students now?
Definitely. And I check in with my students all the time about what they need, what they feel like they're missing. I ask a lot of questions. I'm a very reflective teacher. And I do that because it shows that we care and that we're keeping the mission of the organization at the forefront of our minds as well as theirs. But it also allows us to stay current on our thinking of what we can do to better help serve the community. So I think those things, those activities are which has served kind of as a source of success for Key to Change, and I think more importantly for our students. And I think we're seeing some really great results from our students by continuing to check in with them.
And you said something you just said where it keeps you current. I was looking at I read some papers on South King County, and I was looking at some of the demographic changes over the past 20 years, and it really it's the future of America, right? It is like a demographic breakdown of the place. It's where we're all headed.
Right.
And 33% of kids, or 33% of families, speak a language other than English. I mean, are there any particular challenges around having like a high foreign-born population, high refugee population in the county? Are you serving those kids too? I mean, I looked at your website. It's very diverse kids. So can you tell me about just the range of spectrum of kids you've got in the school?
Oh man, it's quite diverse. Two of the school districts that we have students that they attend schools within those school districts, the Kent School District as well as the Highline School District, have a very high population of students who are either refugee or first generation, or come from a different country or whatever. And so we get a lot of those kind of kids who come into our program, and we meet them where they are. And I think personally in classical music, this is just my opinion, that there's still this kind of hierarchical mentality where it's like classical music is a very high level, highbrow genre, and you've got to meet that standard. You've got to act and assert yourself in that way, and in order to be taken seriously, or to show that, or to demonstrate that you are worthy to play this instrument. And it's very condescending, especially to families who are not familiar with the genre of music. And so that's something that we as a organization work really hard to let students know, hey, you're going to learn about classical music, but you're here to play violin. And we recognize that some students want to become the best players they can. Others, they're using the violin to keep them off the street, to keep them out of trouble, to help them have some sort of focus or discipline, or just to be a better person, you know? And so that's the lens that we use. And I think with those families who are refugee or first generation or whatever their circumstances, that's why they're coming in and they're staying, because they're not being knocked over, knocked upside the head with this notion that classical music or playing the violin is an unobtainable skill.
Mm-hmm. There's a really fantastic book by a guy named Doug Borwick, I think is his name. It's called Building Communities, Not Audiences.
Yeah.
And he talks about that very thing, that first of all, the fine arts, however you want to define them, is a vanishingly small amount of the American population that consumes it regularly. And people don't necessarily consume it voraciously because it doesn't speak to them, because sometimes it's literally, to your point, it's not made for them. And the other thing he gets into that echoes what you were just saying, and it's something that I've been coming to terms with in different ways over my professional career and as a kid, of a certain age, right? Like, I mean, I grew up listening to 90s metal and hip hop, and and I just never could make those worlds connect. But his point is that every culture, every genre of music has excellence. Every genre of music has virtuosity, and that we do a terrible job of recognizing that we just have one type of it, not the only type. And it's incredibly alienating to audiences and students alike when we pitch it as the only way.
I totally agree with that. And I think how I look at our students is most of them are not going to go into music. And that's not the point of our program. We can still provide a high level of music instruction without our kids becoming these virtuoso players or becoming, trying to go to Juilliard or Curtis or whatever. We can still provide that high quality level of music education and help them develop their young minds to become great people in this world. I'm a firm believer in that. It doesn't have to be a one size fits all. And what we're really in the business of is creating communities, because these kids, especially now during the pandemic, oh my gosh, imagine because these kids are all going to grow up, right? And in the next 5 years, they're all going to be in their late teens or early 20s or mid 20s. They're going to look back on this pandemic because we're experiencing history right now. Mm-hmm. And they will not forget how they felt and how they were treated during this time. And this moment, which is a crisis for them, when they experience the next crisis in their life, they're going to reflect back on how they felt and who was there for them during this current crisis. They're going to reflect back on it. And I want to make sure that Key to Change is a positive influence in their lives, so that when they cycle through this life and they come across challenges and they come across obstacles in their lives, when they reflect back to what they've done previously or adults who have helped them in their previous years, I want Key to Change to be a positive experience for them that they reflect back on, not something that's negative or something that's even that they forget.
That's really well said, Quinton. I think that performing arts organizations are in the same boat. I mean, all we really do is provide collective experiences. And when we confuse why we're here is when we really get into trouble. But I do want to use that as a chance to pivot into what you just said, to pivot into talking about how you have adapted to the pandemic and how your teaching has been affected by that.
This is going to sound really crazy, but some people probably think I am nuts, and I don't care. I have been waiting for this moment. I have. I've been waiting, not for the crisis per se, but I've been waiting for this moment to, as the kids say, waiting to flex.
Right.
Because I, through my life and the experiences that I've had, and I've had a lot of different challenges, and I've been able to overcome them, I feel like has really brought me to this moment of where I am right now. And this moment for Key to Change has actually been an incredible blessing for us. Now, it has been an inconvenience, but it has not stopped us. It has not crushed us. It has not destroyed us. It has empowered us, and it has empowered our community. And we have been able to flex and show who we are. And it's been amazing. Since March, when everything kind of exploded, it was like, okay, this is our time.
I think I understand what you mean in terms of being empowered in this. My previous guest was actually a politician. It's a bit of a departure for me on this podcast, but they're campaigning in time of crisis. And in some ways she's saying that they're making more personal connections with voters than they ever would have through this online campaign. So is that what you're saying, that when you've been able to show just how committed you are to the community by being
Absolutely.
There for them? Gotcha.
You nailed it, Rob. That's it. Because 90% of this whole thing is how you show up. Mm-hmm. It really is. And for us, like, our students were out of school for a month. And so their worlds came crashing down. And they were, the governor basically closed schools down like within a matter of days. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So their friends, their teachers, their structure was all just disrupted. And so students were like, what do I do? Mm-hmm. And parents were like, what do I do? And I think the initial shock of our students, most of them, they were sad. There was like, oh yeah, we're out of school. And no one knew for how long. I think they thought at first it was a couple of weeks. And so I think after the romanticized feeling of no school hit, which was probably about a week or a week and a half, then kids were like, oh no, I miss school. And so, we were having very deep conversations with our students about, okay, what do you miss about school? Well, I miss biology. I miss math. I miss my friends. I miss the community. Okay, well, what does community mean to you? Well, I miss being able to debate with my friends. I miss being able to talk about whatever. Okay, so they're giving me real-time data. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, how do we piece this thing together? How do we respond? And so I started asking students, okay, well, you say you miss biology. Well, what do you miss about it? Well, I miss learning about cells. Oh, really? Okay. You like learning about cells? Yeah, Dr. Morris, I'm a bit of a geek. Okay, that's cool. Okay, so if I brought in a biology professor to talk to you guys for an hour, would you guys come? You would do that? Yeah, I could ask one of my colleagues at the university to come. Well, I miss math. Okay, so if I brought in a mathematician or someone like that, or someone, if I brought an accountant to talk about taxes or, how to get a job, would you guys be interested? Oh my God, yeah. Okay, cool. So what I did, I put together an academic lecture series, and I invited 9 of my colleagues from across the country, and every Friday we had a lecture for 1 hour where kids had an opportunity to do some sort of classroom experiment with a chemist, or they did some sort of class presentation with a writer from the Seattle Times, or, when the whole Black Lives Matter movement really took off. We brought in a sociologist to talk about social issues with the students, and their parents came along, and we had a college prep workshop, and we had a source of different activities just to keep kids engaged, to build that community, which was great because in addition to their lessons and in the studio class, they also had this outlet. We weren't necessarily trying to replace school. That wasn't the whole point of why we were doing this. The point was to help build community. And our kids were telling us exactly what it is that they missed and what it is that they felt like they needed. And through our program, we were able to provide that. And it falls, of course, not only within the mission, but within what music actually is, which is not a performing art. It's a liberal art. And most people forget that music is the seventh liberal art. And so, of course, that fits totally within the liberal arts education model. It fits totally within the Key to Change mission by actually incorporating our lessons in with a scholarly component where kids are still feeling like they're learning. So that when they finally did go back to school, which was on an online version, they felt like they had some sort of normalcy because they had been doing it already for a month through our program.
First of all, that's amazing. I mean, it's an amazing work you're doing.
Thank you.
Do you see yourself in partnership or in dialogue with the public schools at all? I mean, we know that music is considered more of a luxury than a liberal art, and it's one of the first things to get cut. So do you see yourself as filling in the gaps of the public schools, but are you also working with public school music teachers and so forth to design curriculum?
Yes, and yes. We don't see ourselves as filling in a gap per se. I like to look at it as we are helping to increase the level of impact for school districts. So we are there to support them. We're not there to compete. We're not there to take away. We're there simply to provide support and help deepen that impact for kids. And I think that's really important when you're working with school districts, especially with public schools, of letting them know that, hey, we're an ally and we're here as a resource. We're not here to do anything other than provide that. As far as our relationship with school districts, we have a pretty healthy relationship with school districts. We provide professional development for teachers. So, for instance, we started working with the Highline School District, which is heavily undersourced, and going in and working with their teachers. And we saw some remarkable improvement in working with them on pedagogy, as well as just classroom design and also how to build an audience and as well as a community online, because most of them did not know how to teach online. So I think that part has been really impactful, as well as teaching and providing lessons for a lot of their students.
I volunteer for a development committee for the Hochstein School here in Rochester, which has been open to all. It's a music school that's been open to all for almost a century now. And they're facing some of the same issues that you've described, but they're going to try and attempt to go back to kind of a hybrid model in the fall in terms of, I think, some voluntary coming back into in-person lessons. Is that something you're experimenting with for September or when the school year starts back up?
No, we're staying online because it works. It works, and we've got the numbers to prove it. 90% of our students have perfect attendance.
Where does that rank relative? Is it higher than it was before the lockdown?
Yeah, wow. Definitely much higher. But let me explain why. Not because kids didn't want to come, but the access. You know what I'm saying? So, if a parent, and I remember this from my own experience as a kid, if you're a single parent and you've got two kids and you got to pick one kid up from daycare, you got to pick one kid up from high school, you got to get this kid to this activity, this kid to that activity. Well, you know what? Some days parents get tired. They're like, you're not going today.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're sitting in traffic for 45 minutes because of a train or because of traffic, which is terrible here in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to your lessons today. I've had a bad day at work and I don't feel like driving you, to your lesson, and so having the lessons online again has been a blessing for us because it has allowed kids to just get to their lesson.
So I want to get to your own training, and you left to go to school to be with the aspiration of becoming a lawyer, as I understand it.
Yeah.
And the music was kind of secondary, but I want to hear about going to an HBCU in Louisiana from Seattle. I bet you that was a bit of a culture shock in its own way. And I want to hear about how the music thing took over.
That was a really interesting time. I went to Xavier University in New Orleans. I was not supposed to go to Xavier University. I was kind of tricked. I wanted to go to Howard University. There was a show back in the 90s called A Different World, which took place on, I believe it was Hillman College. And I loved that show because it was, of course, based on students going to a HBCU. But I loved that show because they would also highlight real life HBCUs. And so I think one of the episodes they highlighted Howard. And of course, lots of legendary musicians and artists and just, people of the Black race have gone to Howard. Jesse Norman, of course, went there. Debbie Allen went to Howard. I mean, all these famous people. And so I knew when I graduated, I was going to Howard. Well, my best friend in high school, Raymond, had said, I want to go to Xavier. And so I mentioned to you earlier that, there was kind of a group of us. We were all in the same classes, and we were all Black. We were all in our honors courses together because there were only like 4 or 5 of us. And so we all kind of supported each other. And so we all made a list of Black colleges that we were going to attend. I'm like, all right, I'm applying to Morehouse and Howard and I think Morris Brown and Fisk because, those were good schools. And so Ray said, oh, yeah, I'm applying to those schools. He's like, Fisk, I don't know about that, but I'm applying to Xavier. And I said, Xavier, where's that? And he's like, New Orleans. I'm like, in the South? I'm not moving to the South. Are you nuts? And so he's like, well, Xavier's a really great school. It's number 1 in placing, Blacks in medical school because he wanted to be a doctor. And I'm like, well, I want to be an attorney. He's like, well, they've got pretty high stats for law too. I'm like, all right, I'll apply to Xavier. So I did. Well, I wound up getting a full scholarship to Xavier. And I didn't get a full scholarship to Howard. So I wound up going to Xavier. Got to Xavier and fell in love with it. I mean, Southern hospitality times a zillion. I mean, everyone was so nice. The food, out of this world. I'd never seen anything like that in my life, And I made some really great friends there. And one thing that was really great about being at an HBCU was I felt like I was at a school of people that I never had to explain who I was to. I never had to. Because everyone was so smart and beautiful and attractive and articulate. And I mean, like, I remember student government was so intense. And I remember learning so much about politics from the students there. And I loved it.
As an aspiring lawyer, were you involved in student politics?
Somewhat. my freshman year, I was definitely involved. I was actually campaign manager for the freshman class president, and he won. Now, I should preface this by saying that campaigns on a Black college campus are a huge deal. Huge. So first, I'll deal with the officers first.
Mm-hmm.
So if you run for an office, you get a budget, and I mean, you've got to basically create a whole political platform. And so that's what I did. So I helped them. So we had like radio spots, and I think we had like a couple of TV spots on the Xavier television station. And I mean, and that was a big deal back in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And helping him write his speeches, and you're hosting, a tea or a happy hour to appeal to all the different types of students on campus. And it was my responsibility to find out all the different cliques and all the different, people. And then you get endorsements by, the upperclassmen or by the fraternities or sororities. And so it was very intense, and I learned a ton. Then the other part of it is there was the homecoming court. Now, the homecoming court was also a very big deal. So if you wanted to become like Miss Xavier, which was the homecoming queen of the university, then she had her kind of cabinet, which was Miss Senior, Miss Junior, Miss Sophomore, Miss Freshman. Those were elected positions, and you had to campaign for them. So whereas you thought it would be a pageant for the women, no, it was a campaign. But if you wanted to become Mr. Xavier or Mr. Senior, Junior, Sophomore, Freshman, it was a pageant. So I was Mr. Freshman. I won the Mr. Freshman pageant. But again, it was very competitive and very intense. And so everything you would think of with a pageant happened, but it was for the men. So it was kind of this reverse, which is what I really loved and appreciated about being at Xavier. It was kind of this reverse roles where you expect the women to do the pageants and the men to do the campaigns. No, the women did the campaigns and the men did the pageants.
This organizing must have been a formative thing for you in terms of your future in organizing concert tours and putting together these complex things. But I don't want to get too far afield because I really do want to hear more about this. I want to hear about your teacher, Rachel Jordan, at the time. And I want to hear about how she changed your path.
She was great. We had a very unique relationship. I miss her. I haven't seen her in years. She changed my life. She really did. One thing that she used to always say to me was, Quinton, I'm not going to curse your will. I am not God, and I'm not going to curse your will. If you want to do it, go for it. And she would always say that to me. But she helped me get prepared for auditions because watching her, she was a violinist in the Louisiana Philharmonic at the time, and she was the only Black in the orchestra. And I remember watching her practice and prepare for the concerts, and she would get overwhelmed, and she was a great teacher. And I was so inspired by her. And I said, I think I might want to become a musician. And she's like, are you sure? Do you even know what that entails? And I'm like, no, but, just kind of watching you, I think I might want to do that. And she said, well, why don't you go to a summer music festival? And if you go to the festival and you feel like you can't live without music after the festival's over, change your major and go into music. And so I went to Brevard in 1998. I'll never forget that summer. It was Robert Shaw's last, he died, I think, that fall. But he was there. Of course, David Efron, fantastic conductor, was the music director at that time. And I mean, everyone was there. Donald Weilerstein was there. His daughter, Alyssa, was like 11 or 12. And she was very young. And I remember Don Weilerstein gave me a lesson in his cabin. And we talked. And he was, I didn't even realize at that time who I was talking to, you know, and all the kids were like, Don Weilerstein gave you a lesson in his cabin. I'm like, yeah, you know, he's a nice guy, a little weird, but he was super nice. And you're like, oh my God, you know. And like I hung out in his cabin for like an hour or two, you know, and just really nice. That summer was transformative. And so I came back and I told Rachel, I want to do this. This is what I want to do. And she said, are you sure? And I said, absolutely. And I went just complete laser focus on transferring. It would take a year. I applied to 2 schools only, Eastman and the North Carolina School of the Arts. My plan was to go to Eastman during the second semester, and it just didn't work out. I mean, it was incredibly expensive. I couldn't afford it. And honestly, when I look back on that whole experience, that wasn't the place for me. And so I applied to North Carolina School of the Arts, and I got in. And but they said that they couldn't take me until the fall. And they gave me a scholarship. It wasn't a lot, but they gave me a scholarship, and I was like, oh, I got a music scholarship. Okay, I'm going. So I left. I left at the end of my junior year. Everyone thought I was nuts. They thought I was nuts. But Rachel, she really pushed me and helped me. She was my surrogate mother during that time. I had this little Toyota Corolla, and she knew a mechanic to help me get my car fixed so that I could drive to North Carolina. She was a very, very inspirational person in my life during that time.
So tell me about the transfer and what it was like going into an immersive musical environment after being around a student body of smart, articulate, diverse, not just diverse people, but diverse interest, and going into a myopic program.
It was a total culture shock, because I went from being at HBCU where everyone was Black and Black excellence was just ingrained within the curriculum, to going to a conservatory that was very intense. I was the only Black male in my class for the 3 years I was there. And frankly, the kids didn't take academics very seriously there. So, you know, if you had an audition or you had a concert or whatever, you could skip class. And the teacher's like, okay, no problem. Skip class. We'll see you in a month. I'm like, what? A month? Are you kidding? What kind of place is this? But that's the kind of place it was. Like you didn't have to go to class if you didn't want to. I mean, that was my experience. And I took my academics there very seriously. And I took music, my practice very seriously. But it was very intense. Most people don't know this, but at North Carolina School of the Arts, you had to be invited back every year.
Oh, wow.
So there was this cloud of anxiety that hovered around the conservatory. So I was in this constant state of fear while I was there, because I was like, oh my God, I just want to get invited back next year, because you could get cut at any time. And I saw so many people get cut. You know, if your teacher didn't like you, or if you came unprepared too many times, you were out. If the orchestra conductor didn't like you, out. It was not a great environment for me. It was needed for what was to come much later in my career. And I didn't understand it at that time, but it was intense. And I didn't have a very supportive teacher during that time. So I went from having a teacher who really helped me and gave me extra lessons and was very positive and encouraging and found a mechanic to fix my car, to a teacher who questioned my total existence of why I was there, and would laugh at me and mock me when I would share my aspirations of what I wanted to do. And it was not positive at all.
There's something in classical, I think it was Arnold Steinhardt in his book, that said that in like the music conservatory culture, you're not good unless somebody important says you're good. Like there's no internal metric that we have. There's not just self-evident. You have to study with the right person or be in the right studio or win the right competition or whatever.
Yeah.
And it doesn't build up a real independent sense as an artist.
It doesn't. And, you know, my time there, I mean, and I should also say, like, I came in with a plethora of technical problems, right? So I needed someone, because I wasn't taking music seriously. I wasn't practicing, you know what I mean? Like, I had a lot of issues within my own playing that needed to be addressed. And I just needed somebody who had the patience to help me. And I didn't. I worked really hard, and I was desperate. I was desperate to get better. So, like, you know, I would have to bring a cassette tape to my lesson, and I would take that cassette tape home and I would listen to that thing for hours and literally write down every single thing and check off the boxes of, you know, did I do it right? I would, you know, I had friends who were to Juilliard and Manhattan and IU, and I would call them up on the phone. I would lay the receiver down and I would play for them and ask them for their help. Like, I was so determined and driven. I mean, I was laser sharp focused, but my teacher just didn't think I could add any value to the field. And I was like, you know, one day I want to play Carnegie Hall, or one day I want to like become a professor. Like, I think I could do this, you know. Man, you're not going to become a professor. Are you kidding, Quinton? Stop lying. He would say, stop lying to yourself. Stop lying. That's not going to happen. Think you'll be a really good elementary school music teacher, you know. And so my senior year there, you know, we have the kind of senior talk, like, of course, you know, like where you're going to apply for graduate school and where you're going to audition. And my instructor at that time, I remember I asked him, I said, are we going to have the talk? And he's like, what talk? And I said, well, the senior talk. Like, and I was the only senior in his studio that year. And I said, well, you know, I want to do auditions for music education. I said, no, for performance. Performance? Why? Quinton, you are not going to be a performer. Quinton, you've got to get this thing out of your head. You should go for music education. I was like, okay. So I played in a local community orchestra during that time. And the concertmaster and I had become really good friends. And her parents, she now plays in Chicago Symphony, ironically enough. And she was actually she was playing in a quartet during that time, the Fry Street Quartet. And she was preparing to leave that quartet. And her parents, I didn't even know this at the time, completely oblivious, were violin professors at the Shanghai Conservatory. Wow. So she, along with her parents, were giving me lessons to help me prepare for my auditions. And I prepped my auditions all behind my teacher's back. He didn't even know.
That's amazing.
And they didn't even speak English. This is what was so crazy about it. They were screaming at me in Mandarin and she was translating. And I mean, and they helped me. They really helped me. And I applied to 10 graduate schools and got into like 7 of them, and they helped. And I mean, I applied to Manus, Manhattan, Juilliard, and my teacher found out eventually what I was doing, because I was getting better. And he's like, "You're sounding good." I'm like, "Oh yeah, I've been practicing, getting ready for my senior recital." And then one of the teachers actually called him and said, "Hey, tell me about this guy, Quinton Morris." And then my cover was blown. But by that point, I just didn't care, because I had already knew what it was that I wanted to do. There were a lot of people during that time who I'm sure bet a lot of money that I wouldn't make it. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't the most talented guy there, but I worked the hardest. I was at the music library. If I wasn't practicing, I was at work, because I had to get a part-time job working at a credit union, and that helped put me through school. And if I wasn't at work, I was either practicing or I was in the music library learning music. And I took all the music classes, all of them, all the analysis, all the theory, all the history. And that wasn't required. But I said, I've got to bulletproof myself, because if I'm going to be in this business and I'm seeing how competitive it is, I've got to know more than everybody.
Mm-hmm. So you had already made the decision in undergrad that you had wanted to go all the way through and get a DMA? Or did you make that choice?
I didn't know that I wanted to get a DMA. I just knew that I wanted to make it in the business. Mm-hmm. I knew. So I only, like, for instance, I only played in 2 master classes during my undergrad, but I went to all of them and I took meticulous notes at every masterclass. The 2 masterclasses that I played in were the masterclasses that no one wanted to play in, because they thought the teachers were too tough. And I was like, I should play. So I played for Miriam Fried and Alexander Kerr.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And Alex and I are very good friends now. Alex was the very first class I ever played for. And then the second class was Miriam. And and kids were like, "Oh my God, yeah. Miriam," or, "Oh, Alex." Yeah. But hey, I was like, if I can play for them and I can make it, I'm going to make it in this business. So that's what I'm saying. Like, that experience was so good for me, because I didn't even realize the amount of resilience and perseverance and just heart that I was learning during that time. It was some tough lessons, but it helped me build character.
Tell me about going down to Texas. Unless you have something that's really huge in your master's program that you want to talk about your life in Boston.
I'll just say that I felt like I died and went to music heaven.
Okay. Oh, then let's talk about it. I mean, I want to hear about it. I know how important Texas was to you, so I want to get to that.
Yeah.
So, tell me about that experience in Boston.
Boston was great. Lin Chang, he was great. I'll never forget meeting him, because he had sent me a message and an email, and we met at MIT, and I played for him. And he said, "Yeah, I want to hear you, man, before you do your audition tomorrow." We just had this instant connection. And he used to tease me and say, "Hey, man, you should run for president. You should become the president of the United States." Like, he would tease me about things like that. And I think Lin is a very, very knowledgeable person. And I mean, he went to Harvard. And so I think he appreciated the fact that I took my academics seriously as well. And so we had a really, really great time. And I loved my time in Boston. That was a great time to be at the conservatory. There were a lot of people, there were a lot of faculty who were bouncing between Boston Conservatory and NEC. And it literally felt like I died and went to music heaven.
That's awesome to hear. I heard Lin Chang play a lot when I was a kid. In the Boston Chamber Players. And
yep.
I saw him play a lot of chamber music when I was coming up.
Yeah. He's and just the nicest guy. Guy. Yeah.
And then, so tell me about going down to Austin and enrolling in that program, and what your relationship with your teacher, what that did for you.
Well, I'll say first that by this point, it was actually Lynn that encouraged me to do a DMA. I wasn't going to do one, but Lynn asked me, so what do you want to do with your life? And I said, well, I had just started the Young Eight. And I said, well, I want to continue to build the Young Eight. I really want to be in New York City because all my friends were there. The majority of the Young Eight was there. And I want to become a college professor. And he said, well, Quinton, if you want to become a college professor, I just have this feeling that you need a DMA. And this is early 2000s still, right? Mm-hmm. And so, people weren't really getting DMAs yet. It was still kind of foreign to most people. And I said, a DMA? And he's like, yeah, you need a DMA. And I said, well, can I get a graduate diploma or, a performer certificate or something? He's like, no, that's not going to fly with universities. And if you want to teach at a university or become a dean or a college mm-hmm. president, you need a doctorate and you should do it now. I said, well, okay. So I had the aspirations of living in New York City, and it just didn't work out for me. I didn't get in to, the DMA program at Juilliard and at CUNY Graduate Center. I mean, they're super competitive. Mm-hmm. And I also applied to Cincinnati and I applied to Texas. And Texas, I had heard about Texas. I actually originally was going to go, I went with the aspirations of working with Brian Lewis. But when I got there, Brian actually gave me a gift and said, because I, was really interested in chamber music. And he said, I think Daniel Ching would be a better fit for you. And so I met Daniel and Daniel agreed to take me. Daniel had never taught any students at Texas. They had just arrived a year before that, the Mural Quartet. And so it was great for me because Lynn, of course, was a chamber music player. And so I felt like I would be continuing that working with Daniel. And so I worked with Daniel and I was his only student for those 3 years that I was there.
Is that because they were touring so much? He only had
They were touring a lot, and Daniel didn't really have any aspirations at that time of growing a studio. So it was somewhat of, I don't want to say a favor from Brian, but I think it was Daniel was curious, and he was like, oh, teaching, that could be kind of fun. Mm-hmm. I'll have a student, and I think Josh Gindel had one student as well. Ironically, both of us, when we graduated, we got jobs. But working with Daniel was very intense, very intense. Daniel's 4 years older than I am. And like myself, a bit of a workaholic. Mm-hmm. And we challenged each other in lots of different ways. When we were on, we were on. And when we were off, we were off. And
can you get into that a little bit more in terms of, so when was there friction between you and Daniel in terms of what caused that friction?
Oh man. Well, I would say some of the friction was caused by both of us have very high standards. And I think during that time, Daniel's standards, I just didn't feel like I could meet them. And Daniel was like, no, you can meet them. You're just lazy or you're just not working very smart. And so, and he was right. He was so right. So he would sit down with me and go over my schedule. Like, okay, Quinton, how much time are you devoting towards lunch? How much time are you devoting towards your study? How much time are you devoting towards your practice? Like, he taught me how to break everything down. And he would literally say, I want to see your schedule. I want to see what you're doing. I want to see how much time you're wasting, Of course, being in my mid-20s, I'm like, what you mean I'm wasting my time? And he'd say, oh, you're wasting time, man. You're not working smart. You're working hard, but you're not working smart. And I'm like, this guy is like, he was busting me, every lesson, learned how to be detailed, That's what Daniel taught me. He would say to me with my playing, Quinton, it needs to feel and sound more organic. It can't sound like a musical idea. I'm like, what do you mean a musical idea? And I'd say, and then he'd say, well, it needs to feel like you're singing, not like you're saying the words. I want you to sing the words. I want them to come from your heart. And he was incredible. And not just as a violinist, because he's an incredible player. But I did chamber music with him. I did score reading with Daniel.
Wow.
I did music history with Daniel, and I did conducting with Daniel. Conducting. So I got a gig where for a year where I wound up becoming like a youth symphony conductor. And so he's like, oh, we got to work on your conducting. So sign up for an independent study with me, and we're going to do conducting once a week. I'm like, are you serious? He's like, yes, you've got to know how to conduct. And so we would sight sing and conduct in the lesson. And then after that, I would have a little break and then come back and do my violin lesson, or then do score reading. This man was so incredible. Like, it was a holistic experience working with him. And because he knew that I wanted a college job. And so he's like, if you want to be a college professor, then you have got to have as many tools in your treasure chest as you can. And so when it came time for me to apply, I only applied to one job, Seattle U, and I got it. Mm-hmm. And the same thing, when I applied, he helped me with my cover letter. He helped me with the interview. Like we did mock interviews when I had to do my recital prep or my recital demonstration. He helped me with that. I had to do a teaching demonstration. He helped me with that. I had to do a lecture. He helped me with that. Daniel taught me how to basically build my own machine.
And assume you've taken a lot of that to your own teaching now at the college level. And your position at Seattle is kind of multifaceted. I was looking at the director of chamber music, instrumental music, arts and leadership, right?
Yeah.
And the African
and global
studies.
African studies. Yeah.
So tell me about your role at the school. Your roles at the school.
Well, I should tell you also that when I came to Seattle University, they hadn't had a music degree, and like at that time it was like 20 years. They didn't have anything, and I was so new and so green. I had done a little bit of adjunct teaching, violin, but I hadn't really done really hardcore teaching. I didn't have a teaching assistantship, so I came in very new, and basically had to rebuild the music program. So my first year, I wrote the Bachelor of Music degree. So I had to create all the classes, and I had to do all the research for NASM, and so a huge administration part. I had to hire faculty, then I had to recruit students and create scholarships and fundraise, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. And I literally built it from the ground up because there was nothing when I got there. Mm-hmm. Nothing. And so the great thing about having those joint appointments, especially in global African studies, is I was able to lean on colleagues in that area who were able to help me. And so like going through the tenure process and going through, all the different hoops that I had to jump through for years, I had some support because I was the only full-time music faculty member at that time. I had no one to lean on. So kind of going back to Texas, those lessons that I learned from Daniel really, really came in handy, and just kind of reflecting back on my experiences, especially in North Carolina, they really, the lessons that I learned there, I started to understand being a new professor, why I went through all that, because it really prepared me for the college life.
So you said that Professor Chang there was saying that you might want to be a university president or a dean down the road. Is that something you see for yourself, or do you see yourself putting more energy into the nonprofit? Or is it not an either or?
More energy into the nonprofit. You know, I think I had a bit of a romanticized view, and I think we all do as students, right? Like, oh, I think I could become a college president. Why? Because they gave a great speech, or they raised $1 million, but you don't really know the nuts and bolts of the job until you get into it. And I think for me, you know, for a long time, I thought becoming a dean or president, I could be pretty good at it. And I still think I could be, but it's not my calling. It's not my passion. Working with Key to Change, growing that organization is my passion. I think with arts organizations and orchestras as well, that there's not enough people who are asking smart questions, hard questions, and there's not enough accountability and just understanding or people who understand the business element of running an organization. And I think that our business, or just arts in general, is littered with people who have absolutely no idea what they're doing when it comes to strategic thinking or strategic visioning, or how to read a balance sheet or a P&L, or just how to keep the financial health of an organization secure so they can execute its mission on a high level. I think that that's where my calling at this time is in the nonprofit sector. And I don't think colleges don't need another college president in Quinton Morris.
Interesting. You know, it's funny, given that we are a market-driven society and a commercial republic, how much financial illiteracy there is everywhere.
Everywhere.
And not just in the nonprofits. Tell me about how your performing career fits in these days. So obviously you're giving a lot of attention to your students and to building this organization. And you have an interesting career as a touring artist too, the Young Eight that you mentioned before, your own solo recital world tours. I kind of want to hear about the business of putting those together. And I want to hear about what part of your career now is occupied by performing.
Well, I can tell you that running the Young Eight, if there's one thing I learned, there's two things I learned. One is how to budget, and secondly, HR.
HR, gotcha.
Oh, yeah. So the budget part first, how to make nothing into something. Our budget for the Young Eight, you want to take a guess how much it was for the first 5 years? Take a guess.
You mean annual? So your annual
our
operating
annual budget. Yep.
And that's, I'd guess,
with no increase for 5 years.
I'm gonna guess like 50,000.
No.
Okay.
$25,000 per year. So I learned the art of in-kind donations, quick, fast, and a hurry. And through the 10 years that we had as an octet, we were only in the red 1 year, and that was our second year. Yeah, second year.
I want to hear about the HR part too. So, I ask this because it's something we talk a lot about in the pro orchestra industry, is that we don't really have any of that, right? You get the job, and then you're left to your own. My colleague in Phoenix, Alex Lang, refers to it as a choose your own adventure novel. You get the job, and then it's completely up to you. So tell me what it was like running a string octet where, with a lot of different personalities, but you're trying to build something together. Tell me about how that all fits together.
It was interesting. Every year we used to do a retreat, and we would bring an outside person in that would help us with our mission and help us just kind of center ourselves. we were all in our early 20s, so we all thought we knew it all.
Mm-hmm.
So we made tons of mistakes. But I think the thing with the HR part that I learned during that time was the importance of relationships, which is so key to really anything. The relationships that you have with people guide your business.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it with Key to Change. In the early years of the Young Eight, I mean, there were some intense times where people were fighting and people were nasty, or people were not being responsible. And I had to be the person to negate those situations. And that was tough. That was really tough to sit two people down and say, okay, how are we going to work through this so that we can play together? We've got a tour together. How do we get through this? Or circumstances that were beyond our control. There was one year where we were on tour. The woman came up to thank me. She was the presenter, and she passed out and died on stage.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And it was a kids concert. That's what it was at the Kimmel Center, of all places. We were doing our debut at the Kimmel Center. We had a whole hour show, and the presenter comes up to thank me, and she kept saying the word performance, and boom, she had a stroke and died right there. And so as the leader, I had to gather everyone together. So I called my uncle, who was a caterer in Philadelphia, and I'm like, I need you to get over here, and I need you to make the most fabulous lunch now, because my people are in crisis. Get over here. And he and his staff rushed over and had this enormous spread just to ease everyone's anxiety. And then we talked about it. I learned the importance of relationships, being with the Young Eight. And I learned the importance of valuing everyone there who was there in the moment. That every person who was in the Young Eight was there to teach all of us something. So I used to tell my group members that there's the 8 of us, and then there's a 9th person who is all of us, all of our personalities and all of our playing styles made up into that one person. And so we've got to make sure that we all care for that 9th person, which is the group. So I learned a lot during that time. And I made a lot of mistakes too. A lot of mistakes. Even through all those mistakes, they just helped shape me and helped guide me as a leader. And then I think the last thing I'll say, and I know you'll relate to this, and this is kind of a dirty word in our business, is I made sure everybody was paid. Mm-hmm. So no one ever had to pay for their own airline tickets. No one ever had to pay for their hotels. And everyone was always paid on time. That's important. And in our business, sometimes people don't pay you on time, or they tell you at the last minute, oh, we can't pay you, or you're waiting a month later. Everyone was always paid. That's a lesson that I learned. Even in our second year, I took out a loan. I took out a $6,000 payday loan to make sure that everybody was paid. My second year when we went in the red, because I valued everybody that much. And that was 2003. That was a tough tour.
What were the mistakes you think you made in that second year that led to the deficit? Were they, in retrospect, were they kind of obvious things, or were they just the growing pains?
I think it was a combination of both. I think there was definitely some growing pains. The octet, we were new. So the first year we were hot, everyone was so excited about this thing that, there was an octet, string octet, and then everybody was black. So you're like, whoa, I've never seen anything like that before, and everybody could play. And then I think the second year, I just didn't fundraise soon enough. I waited a little bit too late. I probably was listening to too many people at that time. I was probably a little cocky too. Looking back on it, I was 24, and I wasn't as prepared. I was not as prepared as I should have been on that tour violinistically, because I was so engrossed in doing everything else. We actually had to cut a quartet because I wasn't ready. That was tough. That was tough. And I had just had, I think a big mistake that I had made was, I'm a cancer survivor. I had stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma when I was in high school, and they inserted a portacath, which is basically this kind of round piece of metal, and they put it in my chest. And that's where I used to get all of my treatments, was through my chest. And my doctor, I had had cancer like 4 or 5 years before that. And so the surgery was incredibly painful. And so because I had cancer and I didn't even know how I had gotten it, and they caught it at such a late stage that they were predicting that I wasn't actually going to make it, that I was going to die. And so I was traumatized through that, and I made it through, and but I kept the portacath inside, and I should have had it taken out. And so my doctor had said, look, you've got to get this thing out now, because it's been in you way too long. 5 years is too long. And so I flew home to have it taken out, and they had said, oh, it's just an inpatient procedure. You'll be fine. Well, and I'm like, okay, well, I've got to play a concert, and I've got rehearsals coming up in the next 2 weeks. Am I going to be okay? And they're like, oh yeah, you'll be fine. Well, I wasn't, because each time I would try to practice, like, my stitches would come out, which meant then I had to go back to the hospital and get restitched. And so it was just a mess. It was a mess. So I definitely learned, don't have a surgery, even an inpatient or outpatient surgery, right before you start a tour. But that second year was really interesting. It was a lot of growing pains, but we started to find our way. I'm so thankful for those 10 years that I had with those people, because we really had some great times, and we did some innovative things that people were not doing during that time.
Such as?
We did a composer competition. We hosted one. We hosted a composer competition and hired judges to do that. We hired judges to judge our composer competition. We did a Black college tour. We had an anthem. We called it the Young 8 Anthem. We were also playing pieces by Black composers. People weren't doing, Imani Winds, of course, was, and you had, I think, Marian Anderson Quartet, they were doing that. And I think Harlem Quartet had just started up around that time or shortly after. And I think they were maybe playing a piece by, either a Black composer or Hispanic composer. But the Young 8, like, we were doing that. We were doing it, and we would bring guest artists in. So we were collaborating with spoken word artists, rappers, singers, opera singers, dancers. We were doing so many different things that allowed us to be multidisciplinary in our work. It was beautiful. And then we had composers within the Young 8. Jessie Montgomery, played in the Young 8 for a couple of years. And so I remember having conversations with her in the taxi when she would say, I'm thinking about going into composing. I'm like, well, you want to flex your composing skills? You want to, maybe you should arrange something for us. And she did. She did some of our early arrangements. And John Littlejohn, another violinist who now lives in Vancouver, he wrote for us. And so we had it was a great group, because we were all able to showcase our skills outside of our instruments. It was pretty revolutionary, because we were young. We were very young, and yet so creative.
Well, Quinton, I knew this was going to happen. We're going to run out of time trying to get to all your stuff. We'll need to pick this up down the road a little bit to hear more about some other things. But I want to thank you Thank you for making time and doing this with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. The music on the show, as always, is by Craig Wagner from Louisville, Kentucky. We'll be back with more interviews soon. Next week's guest is a young woman who is in the ranks of perhaps the hardest working people in the performing arts, ballet dancers. And Cadence recently left the Sarasota Ballet and is embarking on a new journey in business. So go ahead and hit subscribe.